July 13th, 1943, dusk, near Belgorod. On the southern shoulder of the Kursk salient, a field map glows under a green lamp as a phone crackles with distant authority, and a general in a dusted tunic quietly realizes the weight of a single word: halt. The room smells of oilcloth and cigarette smoke, compasses and pencils arranged like surgical tools across the table, and outside the window the rumble of departing half-tracks fades into a long metallic sigh. Aide-de-camp's exchange looks they'd try to keep unreadable. A signaler cups a hand over the mouthpiece, and the silence between syllables becomes louder than artillery. The general nods, repeats the instruction, and places the receiver with the careful finality of a gavel. Because in this small act, he is filing away the last document of the old war and opening the first page of a new one. He stares at the red and blue arrows that promised encirclement, and in the thin hiss of radio static, he hears not the enemy guns, but the mathematics of factories, fuels, and oceans. He has chased brilliance for 2 years, crafted counterstrokes with the elegance of chess, and now he can taste iron on his tongue as he understands that the board itself has tilted against him. To see why this moment matters, we have to walk backward through heat and snow until the pieces align, and we have to feel the texture of each decision under our fingertips, because ideas leave fingerprints. The summer of 1941 began like a prophecy written in dust and gasoline, columns sliding east under banners of speed with promises that the map would fold easily if pushed along the creases. Cities fell in weeks. Field armies were trapped in pockets with names that sounded like distant stations, and the word decisive floated over the fields like a mirage you could almost drink. Train timetables beat like metronomes behind the front, and every communique stitched a narrative of momentum that made criticism sound like poor manners. In staff rooms, the doctrine of annihilation battles returned in a new uniform, and generals who had learned the grammar of movement in earlier campaigns expected the same syntax to parse a much larger sentence. But in the first winter, the language broke. At the gates of a capital, the machines froze, the supply lines became brittle, and the calendar turned into a weapon that did not require bullets. Reports arrived with the dull rhythm of a kettle drum. Engines seized, men dug in, and the offensive voice lost its verbs. One staff diary whispered that the distances are not measured in kilometers, but in lost opportunities, and even the most gifted eye for terrain cannot see over the horizon of logistics. Yet the belief in a decisive stroke persisted, because belief is the last soldier to retreat. In the spring, the argument reappeared with arrows that converged on the Volga, and confidence wore the mask of inevitability. Factories far away hammered out numbers that should have unsettled the bravest brief, but numbers are quiet until a battlefield gives them a voice. By the time a great city on a river became a furnace, the rhythm of the war had changed its meter, and the general who stands by the green lamp tonight had learned a cruel refrain: that courage cannot refill a truck, and skill cannot conjure gasoline. Inside the encirclement, the frost made a museum of the living, and outside it the rescue plan foundered on the math of range and weather, and the sky belonged to whoever filled it every day. The catastrophe that followed did not merely take an army, it stole time, because time is what you spend when you have to rebuild. In the spring of 1943, time is the rarest fuel. That is why the summer plan is framed as restoration rather than conquest, a corrective stroke to flatten a bulge and teach the calendar to obey again. The general argues for a rapid strike with narrow objectives because he understands that tempo is a form of armor and delay is a solvent. But delay accumulates anyway, and delay is loud in factories. Every postponed week is a gift to an opponent with oceans of aluminum and rubber, and every added layer of armor on a tank is a confession that belief in a quick decision has already failed. A visitor arrives from the central headquarters with more conditions than promises, the start date slides, and the enemy digs. Across the lines, Men with spades turn fields into teeth. They string wire into skeins. They build depth like an avalanche in reverse, and the air fills each morning with the gnawing sound of saws as they cut timber for bunkers that smell like wet bark and resolve. The general can feel the plan stiffen until it creaks. He sketches variants, petitions for earlier commitment of reserves, and writes memoranda that read like prayers addressed to reason. He is a professional, and professionals bow to constraints. But tonight the lamp reveals the most merciless constraint of all, the balance sheet. The attack finally opens with armor like anvils, and the sky full of contrails that twist like veins. And for days, the fighting compresses into fields where every meter is bought twice. The enemy defense bends and refuses to break. Minefields exact their arithmetic. And the air war turns the horizon into an unending row of small white blooms. Reports describe a wedge punching forward toward a rail town whose name becomes a spell. But the spell demands blood, metal, and hours, and the price grows while the window narrows. Then, the world intrudes from the south as enemy soldiers appear on an island shaped like the toe of a boot, and a theater nobody in this map room can see sends its echo through the telephone. Suddenly, the question is not whether the wedge will pierce, but whether the theater can afford to gamble at all, because strategy counts fronts, not wishes. When the phone tells the general to halt, he knows that he has just witnessed the final act of a certain kind of war, the kind in which cleverness can corner a larger opponent before that opponent understands what is happening. It is not that cleverness has failed. It is that the larger opponent now understands and has grown teeth behind the shield. Even more than that, the larger opponent has solved the geometry of distance. He has learned to stretch protection across the long roads and to place long hands over the battlefield every morning. The general has seen the new aircraft with drop tanks that turn maps into a single canvas. He has seen ground crews that work by clockwork. He has read captured reports that speak of training that never halts, because there is always another airframe ready for the next pair of hands. He has watched the enemy bomb at noon and escort at 3 and strafe at 5. And each time the reach is longer than yesterday. A staff officer mutters that the day belongs to the other side now, and the general finds no word to contradict him. To make sense of the tide, you have to tally what it lifts. A factory system that builds bombers by the hour. A ship system that lands a new port on a hostile shore and feeds it like a living thing. A rail system that forgets the word exhaustion. And a coalition that keeps promises in steel. Intelligence reports list monthly outputs, and the paper feels heavier in the hand when you read them. But in the end, the reality is simpler than a table. If a machine is always ready when you need it, and your machine sometimes is not, that is the difference between a plan and a hope. The general understands this because he has spent his life converting chances into plans. He is not afraid of battle. He is afraid of arithmetic he cannot change. He remembers a conversation from the previous year when a colleague warned that air cover would decide the next campaign more than any arrow on a staff map. And now he knows that colleague was not pessimistic but punctual. By the time the halt order reaches him, the enemy has made punctuality a weapon. Fighter cover arrives to schedule, interdiction steps on supply to schedule, and the schedule becomes a web the army cannot see but cannot escape. In the following days, counterattacks that would have worked 2 summers earlier fail like fine watches dropped into sand, and the general marks each failure by circling a village name that will be abandoned 2 days later anyway. An intercepted line from the enemy side reads that quantity has a quality of its own, and although the phrase is older than this war and belongs to nobody in particular, it feels like the signature under today's decision. When he writes to higher command, the general chooses careful words, because criticism can become an accusation in transit. But inside the careful words, a conclusion blooms. Our forces remain tactically proficient, but strategic conditions no longer permit decisive exploitation, is what he writes, which is the professional translation of a simpler sentence. We cannot win this way anymore. He does not yet write, "We cannot win at all," because he is cautious and because soldiers invest hope like capital and try not to default in a single day. But the recognition stands behind him like a shadow he can feel if he turns too quickly. The halt order was the hinge. It swung the door from a house with many rooms and fast corridors into a corridor with doors that lock. If the offensive ends here, the enemy will open his own, and if he opens his own with the day on his side, then the ground will begin to move under our feet. The general had once explained to a younger officer that defense is not a wall, but an income problem, and now his own metaphor returns to sting. The army is solvent in courage and bankrupt in time. The files on his desk confirm it. Lend-lease shipments are arriving behind the enemy in volumes that look like misprints, and the Siberian mines and tank parks continue without pause, and the rail lines that his planes once cut with ease now repair themselves like tissue. The liaison from the Air Force briefs politely, but cannot hide the fatigue in his eyes, and his map is overprinted with arrows that represent enemy escorts ranging far beyond last year's limit. On another wall, a situation map of the Western Theater now includes place names that belong to other languages, and he knows that industry and sea have agreed to shorten distances for his enemies. This is the day the war stops being a duel and becomes an audit. In the weeks that follow, the enemy pushes on the northern shoulder, while the general's own formations absorb the blow like a sponge until there is nothing left to absorb with, and then the front starts to ripple backwards. Reports from one sector read that the infantry is intact but never rested, the armor present but never enough, the fuel available but never where it needs to be at dawn, and each never is what kills initiative. The general travels the front in a car that smells of dust and leather, and he stands in orchards with battalion commanders who have memorized the names of every ditch in their sector, and together they talk quietly about bridges and culverts because poetry does not repair roads. The men trust him because he does not lie, and he does not lie because lies waste time. At night, his driver watches him draw small circles on a map and tape thin paper arrows over thick printed ones, tiny acts of defiance against the tide, and the driver later remembers the sound the tape makes, a whisper, like someone shushing a crowded theater. Inside headquarters, arguments grow about whether to issue orders that pull back to a shorter line or to demand counterblows to reassure someone far away that resolve is unbroken. And the general chooses withdrawals that can be afforded because he no longer believes in comfort purchases. He writes that we must exchange land for units because units can act again tomorrow, and land without units is just a word on paper. In this, he is already writing the obituary of the earlier war, the war of dramatic pockets and sweeping arcs. The enemy has learned to dissolve pockets before they form, and to fight arcs into straight lines with weight. There are still victories in the ledger. Local reverses the general wins, with an eye for terrain and timing. But he notes with a cold pen that each is bought at a price we needed for something else. News arrives from other theaters, with the same handwriting, the handwriting of a system that has overcome its earlier clumsiness. In the skies above the homeland, the bombers come like weather, and the factories that once rebounded after every raid now rebuild less quickly, because the rhythm of repair has been broken by the rhythm of return. Rail junctions that used to hum at night now flicker on and off like a failing heartbeat, and the effort to create new fighters competes with the effort to replace bearings and roofs, and competition is another word for fatigue. The general listens as specialists argue about engines and alloys and octane ratings, and he respects them even as he understands that the argument is not about technique, but about scale. He had once believed that superior technique could set the exchange rate of losses, and it had for a while, until the other side expanded the market. The pilots who return report that escorts range to the deepest targets now, And a veteran says with a flat voice that we no longer choose when to fight in the air, we are chosen. The statement is simple and cruel, the way truth often is on the third year of a war. The general could pretend that none of this is decisive, that the war can be saved with a single innovation, a new engine, a new tank, a new miracle of staff work. But pretending is not a staff function. He asks his chief of operations for a forecast through winter and receives a table with 3 columns titled Manpower, Fuel, and Materiel. And the numbers do not argue, they announce. Even if production equals replacement, which it does not, the enemy will force engagements at a frequency that empties the columns faster than they can be filled. This is the conversion of the halt order into a conclusion. It is not that today ended an offensive. It is that today ended the ability to decide when an offensive ends. When he meets with the high command, he is asked for proposals to restore initiative, and he offers realistic suggestions. Shorten the line, concentrate reserves behind rail hubs, refuse unnecessary salients, conserve motor transport for operational coups only. Accept that the air no longer belongs to us in daylight and plan accordingly. Some suggestions are accepted in theory and refused by habit, and habit is the last empire to fall. In private, he writes that the concept of decisive battle has become a superstition that orbits our headquarters, and he knows the sentence is dangerous, and he signs it anyway. His colleagues are not fools. Many see the same edge approaching, and some murmur the word negotiation at low volume, like a prayer with no church. Others argue for stubbornness as a virtue. In itself, and in a sense they are right, because stubbornness is the fuel that keeps an army from collapsing before its time. But it is not a plan. The general refuses to sneer at them because he knows what it feels like to need a belief on a long night. He allows himself one luxury: he walks alone on certain evenings and rehearses the sentence he will never say in public, the sentence that today we have lost the war and must choose how to lose it. He is not a politician and will not become one, so he refines the sentence that he can say that we must preserve the core of the army for the day after, and that to do so we must stop paying for illusions. He returns to his desk and writes orders that look modest and will save men he will never meet. From the outside, none of this looks dramatic. There are no trumpets for defensive art, only quiet rail timetables that fit again and bridges that do not blow under friendly trucks. But drama is not the same as consequence. The consequence of the halt order spirals outward until it touches every theater, every workshop, every ration line, and the spiral only stops when the state itself meets the bill. In later years, people will argue about whether the war was truly lost on this day or that, at this riverline or that coastline, and the general will not participate because he remembers the phone and the lamp and the feeling of a hinge moving. He will say only that a war is not lost in one event, but in the recognition that events have begun to choose you. The months turn into a ledger of retreats and sudden stiffenings, and the general proves again and again that he can still read terrain like sheet music, that he can still hold a line with timing and a windfall of luck, that he can still hurt the enemy badly when the enemy grows careless. But he no longer confuses these accomplishments with reversal. He protects railheads the way a doctor protects pulse points. He chooses ridges for winter that are not heroic but survivable. He conserves cadre and battalions so that when formations must be reflagged, there's still a living memory of how they move together. His reports become shorter and cooler because adjectives cannot manufacture shells. When he attends conferences and hears promises of new weapons that will change everything, he feels an old warmth in his chest because he loves technique and innovation. But the warmth fades when he looks at the train schedules pinned to the wall. A weapon does not change everything if you can only build some. A plan does not change everything if you can only fuel part. A doctrine does not change everything if the enemy has multiples of your everything. This is not despair speaking. It is good staff work. He trains his staff to think the same way, to count backwards from the desired attack to the first barrel of fuel that must be delivered to its supply point on time, and to cancel operations that look beautiful in pencil but ugly in arithmetic. He tells a colonel that the art of command is now the art of saying no without sounding afraid. The colonel nods and later tells his own majors the same line, and the line becomes a quiet shield that saves thousands who will never know its origin. As the end approaches, the general watches the army learn humility, the way a craftsman learns a new tool, awkwardly at first, then competently, and finally with grace. They build flexible defense belts. They write better orders for night withdrawals. They develop better habits for camouflage and radio discipline under constant aerial harassment. And in a kind of bitter achievement, they become exceptionally good at surviving. It is not victory, but it is not nothing. He writes in his notebook that survival is the bridge to any future worth having, and he underlines the sentence because the nearby guns emphasize it anyway. Later, when the capital is a ruin of Baroque stone and ash, and the war ends with the weight of signatures, the general will be asked in a quiet room when he knew. He will say July of 43, and the interviewer will frown and ask about larger disasters, and the general will answer that disasters are obvious to everyone, but turning points are clear only to people who live beside calendars. He will remember the green lamp and the smell of oilcloth and the word halt, and he will think without bitterness that brilliance is a beautiful horse that cannot run without hay. History will write that the war was lost because of this decision and that decision, this leader and that industry, this front and that sea. And history will be correct and incomplete because the truth is that a war is lost when the daily bill grows larger than the ability to pay. He will accept that truth because he learned it alone in a room that smelled of tobacco and dust while the phone cooled under his palm. We end with the image we began with. A field map under a green lamp, a quiet mechanical click, and a professional who understands that the most courageous thing a soldier can do is to see clearly. Seen clearly. This night was not a tragedy, but an education with a difficult tuition. And if there is any redemption in the story, it is that clarity can still save lives even after victory has been priced out.